Dear family of faith, today we gather in a sacred moment of prayer, united by hope and by the deep cry of our hearts, as we turn to Saint Jude Thaddeus, faithful apostle of Christ and powerful intercessor before the throne of God, known throughout the Church as the patron of impossible and desperate causes. If you have arrived here carrying heavy burdens, silent tears, unanswered questions, or situations that seem beyond human solution, know that you are not alone and that heaven is attentive to your cry. There are moments in life when strength feels drained, when doors seem firmly shut, and when the soul searches desperately for a sign that God has not forgotten us. It is precisely in these moments that the Lord invites us to trust more deeply and to call upon those saints who walked faithfully beside Christ and now intercede for us with love and power. With confidence and humility, let us open our hearts and allow this prayer to become a bridge between our suffering and God's infinite mercy. Saint Jude Thaddeus, beloved apostle and friend of Jesus, you were chosen to walk closely with the Master, to hear his voice, to witness his miracles, and to proclaim his resurrection even in the face of danger and persecution. You are known as the saint who does not abandon those who have no hope left, the intercessor who listens when all other voices fall silent, and the protector of those who feel forgotten. Many have called upon your name in moments of despair and have witnessed the power of God unfold through your prayers. Today, with faith renewed, we come to you trusting that you still hear, you still care, and you still carry our petitions before the Lord. As we begin this prayer, we ask you to walk with us and to strengthen our hearts as we surrender everything into God's hand. Beloved brothers and sisters, before we continue, I invite you to make a simple but powerful act of faith that unites us all as one praying family. Write in the comments with trust and conviction, Saint Jude Thaddeus, intercede for me in this impossible case, and let this be your personal offering placed upon the altar of this prayer. By writing this, you are declaring that you believe God can act, even when circumstances say otherwise, and that no situation is beyond his reach. If this prayer touches your heart, I also encourage you to subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and share this prayer with someone who may be silently suffering. Together we are forming a chain of faith, hope, and miracles, trusting that God moves powerfully when his children pray in unity. Saint Jude Thaddeus, glorious apostle and servant of the Most High, today I come before you with a heart that longs for relief, guidance, and divine intervention. I recognize my weakness and my need for God's grace, and I acknowledge that without heaven's help, my strength alone is not enough. You know the weight I carry, the fears that trouble my thoughts, and the worries that steal my peace, even when I try to hide them from the world. I place myself under your powerful intercession, trusting that you will carry my cry before the Lord with compassion and urgency. Teach me, Saint Jude, to trust even when I do not see immediate answers, and to believe that God is already at work in ways I cannot yet understand. Saint Jude Thaddeus, faithful disciple, who remained with Christ even when others fled, help me to remain steadfast in my faith when trials test my endurance. There are days when discouragement whispers that giving up would be easier than continuing to hope, and moments when my prayers feel weak and scattered. Yet I know that you understand the human struggle, because you too faced opposition, misunderstanding, and sacrifice for the sake of the gospel. Strengthen my resolve, so that I may not abandon my trust in God during seasons of waiting and uncertainty. May your example remind me that perseverance in faith always leads to blessings, even if the path is marked by suffering. In this sacred moment, Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you my personal intentions, those needs that weigh heavily upon my soul and seem impossible to resolve. You know the situations that cause me anxiety, the decisions that keep me awake at night, and the circumstances that appear locked with no visible key. I ask you to present these intentions before the merciful heart of Jesus, who sees beyond appearances and transforms impossibilities into testimonies of grace. I surrender my fears, my plans, and my expectations, asking that God's will be fulfilled in my life, even if it unfolds differently than I imagined. Grant me patience to wait, courage to endure, and faith to believe that God's timing is always perfect. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I also place before you my family, my loved ones, and all those whose lives are intertwined with mine. Protect them from harm, division, illness, and despair, and cover them with the peace that only Christ can give. You see the struggles within our homes, the misunderstandings that create distance, and the wounds that words or silence have caused over time. Intercede for healing where relationships are broken, for unity where there is conflict, and for love where hope seems to have faded. May our families become places of refuge, prayer, and renewed faith, strengthened by God's presence and guided by his wisdom. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate intercessor, look with mercy upon those who are suffering more deeply than I am, those whose pain is known only to God. I pray for the sick who await healing, for the lonely who long for comfort, and for those burdened by financial distress and uncertainty about tomorrow. Remember parents who weep for their children, spouses who feel abandoned, and individuals who carry hidden wounds behind forced smiles. Present each of them before the Lord, and ask that his light break through their darkness. May they feel seen, loved, and supported by heaven, even in the midst of their trial. Saint Jude Thaddeus, defender of the desperate, I ask you to strengthen my interior life, and to help me trust God, not only with my words, but with my entire being. Too often, I try to control outcomes, forgetting that true peace comes from surrendering everything into God's hands. Teach me to let go of fear, resentment, and impatience, and to rest in the assurance that God knows my needs before I even speak them. Help me to cultivate a heart that listens, waits, and hopes, even when answers seem delayed. May my faith grow deeper through this prayer, transforming my anxiety into quiet confidence in God's promises. Saint Jude Thaddeus, as I continue this prayer, I ask you to walk beside me during moments of doubt and weakness. There are times when faith feels fragile, when past disappointments make it difficult to believe that change is possible. Yet I know that God never wastes our suffering, and that he can bring good even from the most painful experiences. Remind me that every trial carries a hidden grace, and that perseverance in prayer is never in vain. Strengthen my spirit so that I may continue seeking God, even when the road feels long and uncertain. Saint Jude Thaddeus, powerful intercessor, I lift up to you all those who are praying alongside me in this moment. Unite our intentions, our tears, and our hopes, and present them together before the Lord as a single offering of faith. May no one who prays this prayer feel ignored or forgotten by God, but instead experience the quiet assurance that heaven is near. Encourage those who feel discouraged, and restore hope to those who are tempted to give up. Let this prayer become a source of strength, reminding us that God listens attentively to the cries of his children. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I ask you to help me trust in God's will, even when it challenges my understanding and stretches my faith. Sometimes the hardest prayer is accepting that God's plans may differ from my own, yet I believe his wisdom surpasses all human logic. Teach me to say with sincerity, Lord, let your will be done, not out of resignation, but out of deep trust in his love. Help me to remain open to the ways God chooses to act, knowing that his purposes are always rooted in mercy. May my heart remain anchored in faith, regardless of the outcome I desire. Saint Jude Thaddeus, faithful servant of Christ, guide me away from despair and toward renewed hope. When negative thoughts threaten to overwhelm me, remind me of God's past faithfulness and the countless blessings he has already poured into my life. Help me to recognize signs of grace, even in small moments, and to give thanks for what God is already doing behind the scenes. Teach me to wait with hope, rather than impatience, trusting that God's answers often arrive quietly and unexpectedly. May gratitude replace fear as I continue this journey of prayer. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I ask you to intercede for my emotional and spiritual healing, especially in areas wounded by past experiences. You know the memories that still cause pain, the disappointments that have left scars, and the fears that resurface when I least expect them. Bring these hidden wounds before the Lord, who heals hearts gently and completely. Ask him to restore what has been broken and to renew my mind with truth and peace. May I learn to forgive, to release bitterness, and to embrace the freedom that comes from God's healing grace. Saint Jude Thaddeus, Apostle of Hope, I place my future into your hands, trusting that God already knows the path ahead. I may not see clearly what lies before me, but I believe that God walks with me every step of the way. Help me to trust his guidance, especially when choices feel overwhelming and uncertainty clouds my vision. Intercede for clarity, wisdom, and discernment, so that my decisions may align with God's will. May I move forward with courage, knowing that God never leads his children astray. Saint Jude Thaddeus, beloved intercessor, I ask you to strengthen my prayer life so that it may become a source of peace rather than anxiety. Teach me to pray not only when I am desperate, but also when I am grateful, content, and joyful. Help me to develop a deeper relationship with God, rooted in trust rather than fear. May prayer become my refuge, my strength, and my constant connection to heaven. Let this moment of prayer mark the beginning of a renewed commitment to seek God daily. Saint Jude Thaddeus, as I draw closer to God through this prayer, help me to recognize his presence even in moments of silence. There are times when answers do not come quickly, and when waiting feels painful and confusing. Yet I trust that silence does not mean absence, and that God works powerfully even when he seems quiet. Teach me to rest in his presence, confident that he hears every word spoken from a sincere heart. May I find peace in knowing that God's love surrounds me at all times. Saint Jude Thaddeus, with humility and faith, I offer this opening prayer as the beginning of a deeper surrender to God's will. I trust that through your intercession, the Lord will guide, protect, and strengthen me according to his perfect plan. Even now, I believe that heaven is already responding, arranging circumstances and softening hearts in ways unseen. Help me to remain faithful and hopeful as I continue this prayer journey, confident that God is greater than every impossible situation. May this prayer draw me closer to Christ and renew my trust in his unfailing love. Saint Jude Thaddeus, glorious apostle and tireless intercessor, I return to you in this sacred continuation of prayer with a heart that is more open, more honest, and more aware of its deep need for God's mercy. As I remain in your presence, I feel the weight of my worries rising again, reminding me that my strength alone is fragile and insufficient. Yet I also feel a quiet invitation from heaven to trust more deeply, to surrender more completely, and to believe that God is already listening. You who have been called the refuge of the hopeless and the voice of those who have none, understand the language of suffering spoken without words. For this reason, I do not hesitate to return to you, confident that you welcome every sincere cry placed before you. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the hidden struggles that shape my days and nights, the thoughts that trouble my rest, and the fears that quietly accompany me even when I try to appear strong. There are battles within me that no one sees, conflicts between faith and doubt, hope and discouragement, patience and frustration. I ask you to intercede for me before the Lord, that he may calm my anxious heart and replace my restlessness with peace. Help me to understand that God is not distant from my pain, but intimately present within it. Teach me to trust that even my weaknesses can become places where God's grace is revealed. Saint Jude Thaddeus, faithful witness of Christ's love, I place before you the struggles within my family and my closest relationships. You see the misunderstandings that create distance, the words spoken in haste that wound deeply, and the silences that slowly build walls between hearts. I ask you to intercede for reconciliation where there is division, and for healing where love has been strained by hardship. Bring patience where emotions run high, and humility where pride blocks forgiveness. May the peace of Christ reign in our homes and restore unity, where it has been lost. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I also entrust to you the burdens related to work, finances and daily responsibilities that often feel overwhelming. You know the pressure of providing, the anxiety of unmet needs, and the fear of uncertainty that clouds the future. Many days I work diligently without seeing results, wondering if my efforts will ever bear fruit. I ask you to carry these concerns before God and to ask for His provision according to His perfect will. Help me to trust that God sees my labor and that He never abandons those who rely on Him with sincerity. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate intercessor, look with mercy upon those who suffer illness in body, mind, or spirit. I lift up before you all who are weakened by disease, pain, or long treatments that test their endurance and hope. You know the loneliness of hospital rooms, the fear of diagnoses, and the silent prayers whispered through tears. Intercede for healing where it is needed, strength where healing is delayed, and peace where answers remain uncertain. May those who suffer feel the comforting presence of Christ and the support of heaven surrounding them. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray also for those who carry emotional wounds that time alone has not healed. There are memories that resurface unexpectedly, disappointments that linger, and losses that still ache deeply. I ask you to present these wounded hearts to the Lord, who alone can heal what is broken within. Ask Him to replace sorrow with consolation and despair with renewed purpose. May every wounded soul find rest in God's gentle and patient love. Saint Jude Thaddeus, defender of the afflicted, I bring before you all who feel forgotten or overlooked by the world. I pray for the elderly who feel abandoned, for the lonely who long for companionship, and for those who feel invisible despite their cries for help. You know the pain of being misunderstood and the courage required to remain faithful in obscurity. Intercede for them, that they may feel valued, loved, and remembered by God. May they discover that heaven never overlooks a single soul. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I ask you to strengthen my faith during seasons of waiting, when prayers seem unanswered and time stretches painfully. Waiting often tests my trust and tempts me to believe that God is silent or distant. Yet I know that your own life was marked by perseverance and fidelity, even when immediate results were not visible. Teach me to wait with hope rather than anxiety, trusting that God's timing is guided by wisdom beyond my understanding. Help me to remain faithful, believing that every delay carries a hidden purpose. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I place before you the struggles related to forgiveness, especially when wounds feel too deep to release easily. There are hurts that resist healing and resentments that quietly take root within the heart. I ask you to intercede for the grace to forgive sincerely, not by my own strength, but through God's transforming love. Help me to understand that forgiveness is not weakness, but freedom. May my heart be released from bitterness and opened to peace. Saint Jude Thaddeus, Apostle of Hope, guide me through moments of doubt that cloud my spiritual life. Sometimes faith feels fragile, shaken by unanswered questions and difficult experiences. I ask you to strengthen my trust in God, even when my understanding feels limited. Remind me that faith does not require certainty, but courage to continue believing despite uncertainty. May my doubts become opportunities for deeper trust, rather than obstacles to faith. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for those struggling with addictions, habits, or behaviors that enslave the soul and diminish dignity. You see the desire for freedom and the repeated failures that lead to shame and discouragement. Intercede for liberation, strength, and renewed self-worth for all who feel trapped. Ask God to replace chains with freedom and despair with hope. May each person experience the healing power of God's mercy and the courage to begin again. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I lift up those facing major decisions that carry heavy consequences. Choices about family, work, health, and the future often bring anxiety and fear of making mistakes. I ask you to intercede for clarity and wisdom so that decisions may be guided by God's will rather than fear. Help those discerning difficult paths to listen attentively to God's voice. May every decision be rooted in trust and guided by divine light. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I ask you to help me grow spiritually through this season of prayer. Too often I seek quick solutions without allowing God to transform my heart. Teach me to desire not only answers, but deeper intimacy with God. Help me to see prayer as a relationship rather than a transaction. May my faith mature through patience, trust, and perseverance. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate friend of the suffering, I pray for peace amid chaos and calm amid storms. Life's uncertainties often create inner turmoil that disrupts joy and stability. I ask you to intercede for inner peace that does not depend on circumstances, but on trust in God's presence. Help me to rest in the assurance that God is in control even when life feels unstable. May His peace guard my heart and mind. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you all those praying alongside me at this moment. Unite our intentions and our hopes, creating a spiritual bond that strengthens each of us. May no prayer offered in sincerity be lost or ignored. Encourage those who feel weary and renew the faith of those close to giving up. Let this shared prayer become a source of comfort and strength for all who participate. Saint Jude Thaddeus, help me to recognize signs of God's grace in my daily life. Often miracles unfold quietly, unnoticed, amid routine and distraction. Teach me to see God's hand at work in small blessings and unexpected moments of peace. Help me to cultivate gratitude even before prayers are answered. May thanksgiving deepen my trust and joy. Saint Jude Thaddeus, as I continue this prayer journey, I ask you to remain close to me as a faithful companion. Walk with me through uncertainty, strengthen me during weakness, and remind me of God's promises when hope feels distant. I trust that through your intercession, God is already preparing what is best for me. Help me to continue this prayer with renewed faith, confidence, and surrender. May my heart remain open to God's will as this prayer continues to unfold. Saint Jude Thaddeus, faithful apostle and compassionate intercessor, I come before you again with a heart that continues to search for stability, meaning, and reassurance in the midst of life's uncertainties. As this prayer deepens, I become more aware of the inner struggles that quietly shape my days, the thoughts that return when silence falls, and the fears that surface when hope feels fragile. You know how easily the soul can grow weary when answers seem delayed and burdens remain heavy despite sincere prayer. Yet you also know the strength that is born when trust is renewed day after day, even without visible sign. For this reason, I remain here, choosing faith over fear and perseverance over discouragement. Saint Jude Thaddeus, you who walked closely with Christ and witnessed His patience, teach me to endure the long seasons of waiting without losing heart. There are moments when I question whether my prayers are truly heard or whether my efforts matter in the eyes of heaven. I ask you to intercede for me, that my faith may not depend on immediate outcomes, but on trust in God's unwavering love. Help me to believe that every sincere prayer leaves an imprint on eternity, even when results are unseen. May my waiting become an act of faith, rather than a source of frustration. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I lift before you the inner battles that weigh heavily upon my spirit, the doubts that challenge my beliefs, and the fears that threaten my peace. There are times when my mind feels restless and my heart divided between hope and anxiety. I ask you to bring these inner conflicts before the Lord, who alone can calm the storm within. Ask Him to grant me clarity where confusion reigns and peace where worry dominates. May my interior life be restored and strengthened through God's gentle guidance. Saint Jude Thaddeus, beloved intercessor, I pray for those moments when loneliness feels overwhelming and companionship seems distant. Even when surrounded by others, the heart can feel isolated, longing for understanding and connection. You know what it means to stand firm in faith even when misunderstood or overlooked. Intercede for all who feel unseen, unheard, or forgotten, that they may experience God's comforting presence. May no soul feel abandoned, knowing that heaven walks closely beside them. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I place before you the emotional fatigue that comes from carrying unresolved pain over time. There are wounds that linger quietly, resurfacing when least expected, and memories that still influence present choices. I ask you to present these burdens to the Lord, who heals gently and completely. Ask him to release my heart from lingering sorrow and to replace heaviness with renewed strength. May healing unfold gradually, guided by God's wisdom and mercy. Saint Jude Thaddeus, defender of those in distress, I bring before you the fear of failure that often shadows my efforts. There are moments when I hesitate to move forward, afraid that mistakes will lead to disappointment or regret. I ask you to intercede for courage, that I may act with faith rather than fear. Help me to trust that God can redeem even my missteps and use them for growth. May confidence rooted in faith replace hesitation rooted in doubt. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for those who struggle with guilt and self-blame, often feeling unworthy of God's mercy. Past mistakes can weigh heavily on the conscience, creating distance between the soul and hope. I ask you to remind them, and myself, that God's mercy is greater than any failure. Intercede for the grace to accept forgiveness fully and to move forward without chains of shame. May every heart experience the freedom that flows from God's boundless compassion. Saint Jude Thaddeus, Apostle of Perseverance, guide me through moments of spiritual dryness, when prayer feels difficult and inspiration seems absent. There are seasons when faith feels routine rather than alive, and devotion becomes an effort rather than a joy. I ask you to intercede for renewed spiritual vitality and deeper desire for God. Help me to remain faithful, even when emotions do not support my devotion. May consistency in prayer lead to renewed intimacy with the Lord. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the challenges related to purpose and direction, especially when the future feels uncertain. Questions about vocation, calling, and meaning often arise during times of transition and change. I ask you to intercede for discernment, that God's will may become clearer step by step. Help me to trust that clarity often unfolds gradually, rather than all at once. May patience guide my journey as God reveals his plan in due time. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate intercessor, I pray for those burdened by anxiety about the future. Worries about tomorrow can overshadow the present and drain joy from daily life. I ask you to intercede for peace that anchors the heart in the present moment. Help me to trust that God already holds tomorrow securely in his hands. May faith replace anxiety and confidence replace fear. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I lift up those struggling with strained relationships, unresolved conflicts, and unspoken grievances. Words left unsaid and misunderstandings can slowly erode trust and affection. I ask you to intercede for honest communication and humble hearts, willing to listen and heal. Help those involved to seek reconciliation rather than victory. May love and understanding triumph over pride and resentment. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for those who feel overwhelmed by responsibilities and expectations. Daily demands can create exhaustion and a sense of inadequacy when tasks seem endless. I ask you to intercede for balance, wisdom, and renewed energy. Help me to recognize my limits and to rely on God's strength rather than my own. May rest and renewal become part of my spiritual journey. Saint Jude Thaddeus, faithful friend of Christ, I ask you to intercede for those who feel distant from God due to disappointment or unanswered prayers. Disillusionment can slowly harden the heart, making trust difficult. I ask you to soften these hearts and rekindle hope within them. Help them to rediscover God, not as a distant judge, but as a loving Father. May faith be restored gently and sincerely. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for the grace to remain humble during moments of success and patient during moments of struggle. Life's fluctuations can challenge both gratitude and perseverance. I ask you to intercede for steadiness of heart, rooted in trust, rather than circumstances. Help me to see every experience as an opportunity to grow closer to God. May humility and patience guide my response to every season. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you all those who are silently carrying heavy emotional burdens while appearing strong outwardly. Many smile while suffering quietly. Unsure where to turn for support, I ask you to intercede for comfort and courage for these souls. May they feel God's presence and find safe spaces for healing. Let them know they are never alone. Saint Jude Thaddeus, as this prayer continues, I ask you to strengthen my resolve to remain faithful regardless of external circumstances. Faith can feel fragile when tested repeatedly, yet I trust that perseverance strengthens it. I ask you to intercede for endurance that does not waver under pressure. Help me to remain rooted in hope, even when progress feels slow. May faith become my anchor through every storm. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate intercessor, I lift up all who are praying these words with me. Unite our intentions and strengthen our collective trust in God's mercy. May each person feel supported by this shared act of prayer. Encourage those who feel weary and reassure those who doubt. Let this moment become a turning point toward renewed faith. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I place this continuation of prayer into your hands with confidence and trust. I believe that God is listening attentively and working quietly beyond what I can see. Help me to continue this journey with patience, openness, and faith. May my heart remain receptive to God's guidance as this prayer unfolds further. I trust that through your intercession, hope is being renewed even now. Saint Jude Thaddeus, glorious apostle of the Lord and steadfast witness of unshakable faith, I return to you once more with a heart that longs for strength, courage, and renewal as this prayer continues to unfold. The journey of faith is not always gentle, and there are moments when the soul feels bruised by disappointment, delay, and repeated trials. You understand what it means to remain faithful when the path is difficult and the cost of discipleship feels heavy. In these moments, I cling to your example, trusting that perseverance in faith is never wasted in the eyes of God. I come again, not because my strength has increased, but because my trust in God's mercy is growing. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I confess before you that there are times when fear quietly takes hold of my heart and clouds my confidence in God's promises. I worry about outcomes I cannot control and imagine failures that have not yet occurred. These fears drain my energy and weaken my hope, making the future appear uncertain and fragile. I ask you to carry these fears to the Lord and to intercede for freedom from anxiety that steals my peace. Help me to replace fear with trust and to remember that God walks ahead of me, preparing the way even when I cannot see it. Saint Jude Thaddeus, you who remained loyal to Christ even when opposition arose, teach me how to stand firm in faith when circumstances challenge my beliefs. There are times when faith feels tested by loss, disappointment, or unanswered prayer, and the temptation to doubt grows stronger. I ask you to intercede for unwavering trust that does not depend on favorable conditions. Help me to believe that God's love remains constant even when life feels unstable. May my faith deepen through trials rather than diminish under their weight. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the weariness that comes from prolonged struggle, when problems linger and solutions seem distant. Carrying burdens for too long can exhaust the spirit and dull the joy of living. I ask you to intercede for renewed strength and resilience, that I may continue forward without surrendering to despair. Help me to rest in God's presence and to draw strength from prayer rather than from my limited abilities. May perseverance become a source of growth rather than exhaustion. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate intercessor, I lift up those who feel overwhelmed by grief and loss, especially when healing feels slow and incomplete. Loss leaves a silence that words cannot fill, and a longing that lingers beyond understanding. I ask you to present these grieving hearts to the Lord, who understands sorrow and draws near to the broken-hearted. Ask him to pour comfort into their pain and to remind them that love does not end with loss. May hope slowly rise again, even amid sorrow. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for courage to face challenges rather than retreat from them. There are moments when avoidance feels easier than confrontation and silence feels safer than truth. I ask you to intercede for boldness rooted in faith, not arrogance, and strength guided by humility. Help me to confront difficulties with prayerful discernment rather than fear. May God's wisdom guide my actions and words in every situation. Saint Jude Thaddeus, defender of the afflicted, I bring before you those who feel crushed by injustice, misunderstanding, or unfair treatment. Such experiences can leave deep wounds and foster bitterness if left unresolved. I ask you to intercede for healing, justice, and inner peace for those affected. Help them to trust that God sees all things and that nothing escapes his attention. May they find comfort in knowing that God's justice is rooted in mercy and truth. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I ask you to intercede for those who struggle with discouragement after repeated setbacks. When efforts seem fruitless and progress appears stalled, hope can easily fade. I ask you to remind us that growth often occurs beneath the surface, unseen but real. Help us to trust that God works even in apparent failure. May renewed hope take root where discouragement once prevailed. Saint Jude Thaddeus, faithful companion in suffering, I pray for those burdened by responsibilities that feel heavier than they can bear. Many carry obligations without support, fearing that asking for help may be seen as weakness. I ask you to intercede for humility, to seek assistance, and wisdom to accept support when needed. Help us to recognize that reliance on others reflects trust rather than failure. May shared burdens become lighter through compassion and community. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you those struggling with inner conflicts between faith and doubt, desire and restraint, hope and fear. These inner tensions can drain spiritual energy and create confusion. I ask you to intercede for clarity and peace within the heart. Help us to align our desires with God's will and to find harmony within ourselves. May inner peace replace turmoil through God's guiding presence. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for those who feel unworthy of God's blessings due to past mistakes or lingering guilt. Shame can distort self-worth and hinder spiritual growth. I ask you to intercede for healing from shame and renewed confidence in God's mercy. Help us to embrace forgiveness fully and to believe that God delights in restoring his children. May grace replace self-condemnation. Saint Jude Thaddeus, Apostle of Hope, I lift up those who feel spiritually stagnant, longing for renewal but unsure how to move forward. Spiritual dryness can lead to frustration and doubt when prayer feels empty. I ask you to intercede for renewed desire for God and deeper spiritual awakening. Help us to trust that even dry seasons serve a purpose. May perseverance lead to renewed vitality and faith. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for wisdom in navigating life's transitions when familiar patterns change and uncertainty grows. Transitions often bring anxiety and hesitation, challenging our sense of security. I ask you to intercede for courage to embrace change with trust. Help us to see transitions as opportunities for growth rather than threats to stability. May God's guidance be evident in every new beginning. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate intercessor, I lift up those who feel isolated in their struggles, believing no one understands their pain. Isolation can deepen suffering and erode hope. I ask you to intercede for connection, understanding, and comfort. Help them to experience God's presence through unexpected sources of support. May loneliness be replaced with a sense of belonging. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for patience during moments when answers seem delayed and clarity remains elusive. Waiting can test endurance and strain faith. I ask you to intercede for patience that trusts God's timing rather than demands immediate resolution. Help us to remain faithful during uncertainty. May waiting become a spiritual discipline that deepens trust. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you all those praying this prayer with sincerity and need. Unite our hearts and intentions, strengthening each of us through shared faith. May no one feel unheard or unseen by God. Encourage those on the brink of giving up. Let this prayer renew confidence in God's mercy. Saint Jude Thaddeus, as this prayer continues, I ask you to remain close and attentive to every unspoken plea. I trust that God is working even now, shaping outcomes according to his wisdom. Help me to continue this prayer journey with humility and perseverance. May my heart remain open to God's transforming grace. I believe that through your intercession, strength and hope are being restored. Saint Jude Thaddeus, glorious apostle and faithful servant of Christ, I come before you again with a heart that has been stretched by waiting, shaped by trials, and softened by the quiet realization that I cannot carry everything alone. As this prayer deepens, I sense how much I depend on God's mercy and how fragile my own strength can be when burdens persist without relief. There are days when perseverance feels heavy and hope feels distant. Yet I remain here because faith invites me to continue even when answers are not immediate. You understand this perseverance because your own life was marked by steadfast trust amid uncertainty and sacrifice. I ask you to stand beside me now, strengthening my resolve to continue believing. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the moments when discouragement tries to take root in my thoughts and slowly erode my confidence. Repeated struggles can create weariness that seeps into prayer, making it harder to speak with the same fervor and expectation as before. I ask you to intercede for renewed spiritual strength that does not depend on emotions or visible results. Help me to remember that faith is often proven in endurance rather than in instant victory. May perseverance become an act of worship that honors God even in silence. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate intercessor, I lift up the fears related to provision and security that quietly trouble my heart. Worries about finances, stability, and the future can create constant tension that disrupts peace and trust. I ask you to present these concerns to the Lord, who knows every need before it is spoken. Help me to rely on God's faithfulness rather than my limited understanding of outcomes. May trust replace anxiety as I learn to rest in divine providence. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for those who carry the burden of responsibility for others, while neglecting their own needs. Caregivers, parents, leaders and servants often give endlessly without receiving adequate support. I ask you to intercede for renewal and balance, that they may find rest without guilt and strength without exhaustion. Help them to recognize that caring for themselves honors God's design rather than diminishing their service. May compassion extend inward as well as outward. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the struggles related to self-worth and identity that arise from comparison and unmet expectations. It is easy to measure life against others and feel inadequate or behind. I ask you to intercede for freedom from comparison and renewed confidence, rooted in God's love. Help me to remember that each life unfolds according to a unique purpose, guided by divine wisdom. May contentment and gratitude replace insecurity and self-doubt. Saint Jude Thaddeus, defender of those in distress, I lift up those who feel trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Situations involving legal matters, family conflicts, or long-standing obstacles can create a sense of helplessness and frustration. I ask you to intercede for courage and patience as God works behind the scenes. Help them to trust that even when movement feels impossible, progress may still be unfolding unseen. May hope remain alive despite limitation. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for those who struggle to forgive themselves for past decisions that continue to affect the present. Regret can linger and cloud the future with guilt and self-judgment. I ask you to intercede for healing that allows the heart to release what cannot be changed. Help us to accept God's mercy fully and to move forward with renewed purpose. May self-compassion, guided by faith, replace harsh self-criticism. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the tension between longing for change and fearing what change may require. Transformation often demands surrender, patience, and courage that feel difficult to offer. I ask you to intercede for openness to God's work, even when it challenges comfort and familiarity. Help me to trust that God's plans lead toward freedom rather than loss. May willingness replace resistance as I continue this prayer. Saint Jude Thaddeus, Apostle of Hope, I lift up those who feel spiritually isolated, longing for deeper connection with God, but unsure how to begin. Distance from God can feel overwhelming and discouraging. I ask you to intercede for renewed desire for prayer and intimacy with the Lord. Help them to take small steps toward faith without fear of judgment. May gentle invitations from God restore closeness and trust. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for those navigating complex emotions that shift rapidly between hope and despair. Emotional instability can create confusion and fatigue, making it difficult to maintain balance. I ask you to intercede for emotional healing and steadiness rooted in God's peace. Help us to recognize emotions without being ruled by them. May inner calm gradually replace turbulence. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the longing for meaningful purpose that often surfaces during times of uncertainty. When direction feels unclear, life can seem fragmented and restless. I ask you to intercede for discernment and clarity as God reveals purpose step by step. Help me to trust that purpose unfolds through faithful presence rather than rushed decisions. May patience guide my search for meaning. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate intercessor, I lift up those facing strained relationships marked by distance, misunderstanding, or unresolved conflict. Emotional separation can cause deep pain and lingering sadness. I ask you to intercede for reconciliation, empathy, and honest dialogue, guided by humility. Help hearts soften and communication reopen. May healing restore connections according to God's will. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for those burdened by chronic stress that slowly erodes joy and vitality. Constant pressure can dull spiritual awareness and weaken resilience. I ask you to intercede for rest that renews both body and spirit. Help us to recognize when rest is needed and to accept it without guilt. May renewal become a sacred practice rather than a neglected necessity. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you those who feel unseen despite their efforts and sacrifices. Recognition may be absent, leading to discouragement and self-doubt. I ask you to intercede for assurance that God sees every act of love and faithfulness. Help them to find fulfillment in God's approval rather than human acknowledgement. May quiet faith be strengthened by divine affirmation. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for perseverance during moments when progress seems painfully slow. Growth often occurs gradually, testing patience and resolve. I ask you to intercede for endurance that remains steady through delays. Help me to trust that small steps still lead forward. May persistence guided by faith replace frustration. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I lift up all who are praying alongside me at this moment, each carrying unique burdens and hopes. Unite our intentions and strengthen our collective trust in God's mercy. May each person feel supported and encouraged through this shared prayer. Renew courage where fatigue has settled. Let this moment foster deeper faith. Saint Jude Thaddeus, as this prayer continues, I place my trust more fully in God's presence and guidance. I believe that even now, unseen changes are taking place according to divine wisdom. Help me to continue with patience, humility, and openness to God's will. May my heart remain receptive to transformation and grace. I trust that through your intercession perseverance is being renewed. Saint Jude Thaddeus, glorious apostle and unwavering companion of those who suffer, I come before you again with a heart that has learned to hope, even while carrying unresolved burdens. As this prayer continues, I recognize how deeply human my fears are, and how easily my trust can waver when circumstances remain unchanged. Yet I also sense a quiet strengthening within me, born not from solutions but from surrender. You understand this inner transformation, because faith often grows strongest where certainty is weakest. I ask you to remain near, guiding my heart toward deeper reliance on God. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the fatigue that comes from prolonged uncertainty, when waiting stretches longer than expected, and patience feels thin. Repeated delays can drain motivation and make perseverance feel heavy. I ask you to intercede for renewed endurance that does not collapse under time's weight. Help me to believe that waiting is not wasted, but formative, shaping character and deepening faith. May I learn to wait with purpose rather than frustration. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate intercessor, I lift up the fear of disappointment that sometimes holds me back from hoping fully. Protecting the heart can feel safer than risking renewed trust after past letdowns. I ask you to intercede for courage to hope again, even when vulnerability feels risky. Help me to trust that God's promises remain faithful regardless of past outcomes. May hope become an act of faith rather than a fragile emotion. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for clarity during moments of confusion, when decisions feel overwhelming and direction seems unclear. Uncertainty can cloud judgment and create anxiety that disrupts peace. I ask you to intercede for discernment, guided by God's wisdom rather than fear. Help me to take one faithful step at a time, rather than demand immediate answers. May confidence grow gradually as trust deepens. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the inner resistance that sometimes arises when God's path differs from my expectations. Surrender can feel like loss when personal plans are challenged or delayed. I ask you to intercede for openness to God's will, even when it stretches my comfort. Help me to see surrender as trust rather than defeat. May willingness replace resistance as faith matures. Saint Jude Thaddeus, defender of the weary, I lift up those who feel overwhelmed by constant responsibility without reprieve. Continuous demands can lead to burnout and emotional exhaustion. I ask you to intercede for rest that restores strength and renews perspective. Help us to recognize that rest is not a sign of weakness, but an act of trust in God's provision. May renewal become possible even amid obligation. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for those burdened by unresolved grief that resurfaces unexpectedly. Loss does not follow a predictable timeline and often returns in waves. I ask you to intercede for gentle healing that respects the depth of love once shared. Help grieving hearts find comfort without pressure to move on prematurely. May hope slowly re-emerge alongside remembrance. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the struggle to maintain faith when progress feels invisible. Trusting what cannot be seen requires courage that does not always come easily. I ask you to intercede for faith that rests in God's character rather than invisible results. Help me to believe that unseen work can be just as powerful as visible change. May perseverance be sustained by trust. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate intercessor, I lift up those facing isolation due to circumstances beyond their control. Distance from loved ones, separation, or life transitions can intensify loneliness. I ask you to intercede for connection that transcends physical presence. Help them to feel God's closeness even when human companionship is limited. May isolation give way to spiritual consolation. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for emotional balance during seasons of heightened stress and uncertainty. Emotional fluctuations can create instability and exhaustion. I ask you to intercede for calm rooted in God's peace, rather than external stability. Help me to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. May inner steadiness replace emotional turbulence. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the longing for assurance that efforts are meaningful despite slow progress. When results are delayed, motivation can falter. I ask you to intercede for reassurance that faithfulness itself carries value in God's eyes. Help me to measure success by obedience rather than outcomes. May quiet perseverance be strengthened by trust. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for those struggling with unresolved conflicts that linger beneath the surface. Avoidance can seem easier than addressing pain directly. I ask you to intercede for courage and wisdom to pursue reconciliation when possible. Help hearts open to understanding and humility. May healing replace distance according to God's will. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate intercessor, I lift up those navigating transitions that disrupt familiar routines and identities. Change often brings uncertainty and fear of the unknown. I ask you to intercede for courage to embrace new chapters with trust. Help them to believe that God accompanies every transition. May faith guide each step forward. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the desire for deeper spiritual growth beyond surface-level faith. Routine can dull devotion if not nurtured intentionally. I ask you to intercede for renewed hunger for God's presence. Help me to seek intimacy rather than convenience in prayer. May faith deepen through intentional surrender. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for patience during moments when understanding remains incomplete. Questions without answers can challenge faith and create frustration. I ask you to intercede for trust that does not require full comprehension. Help me to accept mystery without fear. May peace coexist with unanswered questions. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I lift up all who are praying alongside me in this moment of continued supplication. Unite our hearts and intentions, strengthening each through shared faith. May encouragement flow where weariness has settled. Renew confidence in God's attentive care. Let this prayer sustain hope. Saint Jude Thaddeus, as this prayer continues, I place myself more fully into God's hands, trusting His wisdom beyond my own. I believe that transformation often unfolds quietly and gradually. Help me to remain faithful and receptive to God's guidance. May trust deepen as surrender grows. I continue this prayer with confidence in your intercession. Saint Jude Thaddeus, glorious apostle and faithful intercessor of those who feel pressed beyond their limits, I return to you once more, with a heart that now understands how deeply it needs God's sustaining grace. As this prayer advances, I sense that my soul has been stripped of illusions of control and brought face to face with dependence on divine mercy. There are moments when this dependence feels uncomfortable, even frightening, yet it is also the place where true faith begins to breathe freely. You, who trusted God even when the path led through sacrifice and uncertainty, understand this surrender. Walk beside me now, as I continue to place everything into God's hand. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the deepest interior struggles that I rarely name aloud, the fears that surface in quiet moments, and the thoughts that challenge my sense of peace. These inner conflicts often remain hidden from others, yet they influence every decision and emotion. I ask you to intercede for interior healing that reaches beyond surface calm and touches the root of anxiety and unrest. Help me to trust that God sees every hidden battle and offers grace sufficient for each one. May my inner life be slowly restored through faith and patience. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate intercessor, I lift up the feeling of spiritual exhaustion that sometimes follows long seasons of prayer without visible change. When effort seems to outweigh consolation, discouragement can quietly settle into the heart. I ask you to intercede for renewed spiritual strength that does not depend on emotional reassurance. Help me to continue praying faithfully, even when consolation is absent. May faith mature through endurance, rather than emotional satisfaction. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for those moments when hope feels fragile and easily shaken by circumstances beyond control. Unexpected setbacks can revive old fears and reopen wounds thought healed. I ask you to intercede for resilience that allows hope to rise again after disappointment. Help me to remember that God's plans are not undone by temporary obstacles. May hope remain anchored in divine faithfulness rather than fragile outcomes. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the struggle to trust God fully with the unknown future. Uncertainty often invites anxiety and attempts to control what cannot be predicted. I ask you to intercede for surrender that brings peace rather than fear. Help me to accept that not knowing is part of the journey of faith. May trust replace the need for certainty as my relationship with God deepens. Saint Jude Thaddeus, defender of those in anguish, I lift up those weighed down by mental and emotional burdens that distort clarity and drain energy. Persistent worry, sadness, and fear can cloud judgment and weaken hope. I ask you to intercede for healing that restores balance and perspective. Help these souls experience God's gentle reassurance and steady presence. May emotional weight gradually give way to inner peace. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for those who feel trapped by patterns they long to escape but struggle to change. Habits, fears, and repeated behaviors can create cycles that feel impossible to break. I ask you to intercede for freedom rooted in God's power rather than human will alone. Help them to believe that transformation is possible, even when progress feels slow. May perseverance open the door to lasting change. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate friend of the discouraged, I bring before you those who feel overlooked or unappreciated despite sincere effort. Lack of recognition can quietly erode motivation and self-worth. I ask you to intercede for assurance that God sees every hidden sacrifice. Help them to find meaning in faithfulness rather than acknowledgement. May divine affirmation replace human validation. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for those burdened by regret over missed opportunities and past decisions. Dwelling on what cannot be changed can steal joy from the present and hope from the future. I ask you to intercede for peace that allows the past to rest in God's mercy. Help us to trust that God redeems even what feels wasted. May renewed purpose arise from surrendered regret. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the longing for stability amid ongoing change. Shifting circumstances can create a sense of insecurity and restlessness. I ask you to intercede for grounding rooted in God's unchanging presence. Help me to find stability not in circumstances but in faith. May trust become the anchor that steadies my heart. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate intercessor, I lift up those struggling with patience toward themselves and others. Impatience can create frustration and strain relationships unnecessarily. I ask you to intercede for gentleness that fosters understanding and compassion. Help us to extend grace to ourselves as God extends grace to us. May patience become a fruit of growing faith. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for clarity in moments when emotions conflict with reason and faith. Emotional intensity can distort perspective and lead to impulsive choices. I ask you to intercede for wisdom that balances feeling with discernment. Help me to pause and seek God's guidance before acting. May thoughtful discernment guide every decision. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you the desire to trust God not only in crisis, but in ordinary daily life. Faith often intensifies during hardship, but weakens during routine. I ask you to intercede for consistent devotion that remains steady regardless of circumstances. Help me to cultivate daily trust rather than reactive faith. May ordinary moments become opportunities for deeper reliance on God. Saint Jude Thaddeus, compassionate intercessor, I lift up those navigating silent suffering that goes unnoticed by others. Hidden pain can feel heavier when carried alone. I ask you to intercede for comfort that reaches the unseen corners of the heart. Help them to feel God's closeness, even when words fail. May solitude be transformed into sacred encounter. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray for perseverance when faith is tested repeatedly by delay and uncertainty. Repeated trials can weaken resolve if hope is not continually renewed. I ask you to intercede for endurance, grounded in trust, rather than outcome. Help me to remain faithful without conditions. May steadfastness grow stronger through repetition. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I lift up all who are praying these words with sincerity and expectation. Unite our intentions and strengthen our shared faith. May encouragement flow among us, even without direct connection. Renew confidence where doubt has settled. Let this prayer continue to nurture hope. Saint Jude Thaddeus, as this prayer approaches its final movement, I entrust to you the quiet transformation taking place within my heart. I trust that God has been working through every word, every pause, and every act of surrender. Help me to remain open to the grace unfolding even now. May faith continue to deepen beyond this prayer. I place my trust in your intercession with confidence and peace. Saint Jude Thaddeus, glorious apostle and faithful servant of our Lord Jesus Christ, I come before you now in this final movement of prayer with a heart laid bare, surrendered, and filled with reverent trust. After walking through fear, waiting, hope, and perseverance, I stand before God no longer trying to carry my burdens alone. I recognize that every word spoken in this prayer has been heard in heaven, gathered with care, and placed before the merciful heart of God. I believe that nothing offered in faith is ever lost or ignored, even when answers unfold slowly and quietly. With this confidence, I entrust myself completely to God through your powerful intercession. Saint Jude Thaddeus, in this closing supplication, I offer you not only my requests, but my entire life as it is, with all its imperfections, questions, and hopes. I place into your hands my past, with its regrets, my present with its struggles, and my future with all its uncertainty. I surrender my desires, my plans, and even my fears, asking that all be shaped according to God's holy will. Teach me to trust that God's plans are always rooted in love, even when they differ from my expectations. May my life become an offering that glorifies God in both joy and trial. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I ask you to remain beside me when this prayer ends and silence returns, when daily life resumes and challenges remain. Help me not to forget the peace I have encountered here, nor the faith that has been strengthened through this time of prayer. When doubts attempt to return, remind me of God's faithfulness and of the grace already at work within me. When fear arises again, help me recall that I am never abandoned. May the fruits of this prayer continue to unfold long after these words have been spoken. Saint Jude Thaddeus, protector of the afflicted and defender of the desperate, I lift before you all who have prayed these words with me, whether aloud or in the quiet of their hearts. You know each intention, each silent cry, and each burden that could not be fully expressed. I ask you to present every one of these souls to the Lord with tenderness and urgency. Let no one leave this prayer without being touched by God's peace, strength, or consolation. May each person experience the assurance that heaven is near. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I pray especially for those who feel that their situation truly has no solution, whose circumstances appear locked beyond all human ability. Remind them that God is not limited by what we see or understand. Help them to trust that divine intervention often arrives in unexpected ways and at unexpected times. Strengthen their faith to believe that miracles are still possible, even when hope feels faint. May their trust in God be renewed and sustained. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I place before you those who continue to suffer in silence, carrying pain that others do not see or understand. Emotional wounds, spiritual struggles, and hidden anxieties often weigh heavier than visible trials. I ask you to intercede for comfort that reaches the deepest places of the heart. Help them to feel God's closeness even in moments of loneliness. May healing begin gently, guided by God's mercy and patience. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I ask you to help me live differently after this prayer, not merely asking for change, but becoming open to transformation. Teach me to respond to difficulties with greater trust and to blessings with deeper gratitude. Help me to remember that faith is lived daily through small acts of surrender and obedience. May I walk forward with a heart more anchored in God and less shaken by circumstance. Let my life reflect the hope I have prayed for here. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I entrust to you my family, my loved ones, and all those connected to my life, whether near or far. Protect them, guide them, and draw them closer to God's grace. Heal what is broken among us, and strengthen what is weak. May our relationships be marked by patience, forgiveness, and love. Let God's peace rest upon our homes and hearts. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I thank God for the strength He has already given me, even before visible answers arrive. I recognize that endurance itself is a gift, and that faith sustained through waiting is already a form of victory. Help me to remain grateful, not only for what I hope to receive, but for what God has already done. Teach me to see grace in progress, not only in completion. May gratitude guard my heart against discouragement. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I ask you to help me continue trusting God's timing, especially when it challenges my patience and understanding. Waiting often reveals where trust is weakest, yet it is also where faith can grow strongest. Help me to wait without resentment and hope without anxiety. May I learn to rest in God's promises, even when fulfilled distant. Let peace accompany me as I continue forward. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I bring before you my deepest intention, the one that weighs most heavily upon my heart, trusting that you know it fully. I place it before God without conditions, asking not only for resolution, but for the grace to accept His will. Help me to believe that whatever God allows will ultimately serve my good and His glory. Strengthen me to remain faithful regardless of the outcome. May trust replace fear completely. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I ask you to intercede that my faith may endure beyond moments of crisis and become a steady foundation for life. Help me to pray not only when I am desperate, but also when I am calm, grateful, and secure. Teach me to remain connected to God in ordinary moments, as well as extraordinary ones. May prayer become a constant source of strength and guidance. Let my relationship with God deepen daily. Saint Jude Thaddeus, as I approach the conclusion of this prayer, I surrender once more everything I have spoken and everything left unspoken. I trust that God has received each word according to His wisdom and love. I release the need to control outcomes and rest in divine care. Help me to walk forward in peace, confident that God is already at work. May faith continue to grow within me. Saint Jude Thaddeus, with humility and trust, I now unite my voice with the prayer that Jesus Himself taught us, placing my life fully into the hands of our Heavenly Father. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be Thy name. Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Saint Jude Thaddeus, I thank you for your powerful intercession and for your faithful presence throughout this prayer. I trust that you have carried my petitions to the heart of Jesus, and that grace is already unfolding in my life. Even if answers come slowly, I choose to remain hopeful and steadfast. I believe that God never abandons those who trust in Him. With gratitude and peace, I surrender all into God's hand. Saint Jude Thaddeus, may your light continue to guide me, your example strengthen me, and your intercession protect me always. May I never lose faith, even in the face of difficulty, and may hope remain alive within my heart. I place my life, my needs, and my future entirely before God. I trust in His mercy, His timing, and His perfect will. Amen.